And I would now like to introduce, again, ask my co-chair, Dr. Afonso, to introduce our final speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Maharaj. So our final speaker is Dr. Priya Mohan from the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, and she will be presenting on bridging the climate finance gap, challenges and opportunities for Caribbean SIDS. Yes, Dr. Mohan.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for the opportunity to present this morning. Okay, so my presentation is entitled Bridging the Climate Finance Gap, Challenges and Opportunities for Caribbean SIDS. Now let's take a step back and look at the Paris Agreement back in 2015 and how it relates to climate finance. Now, when we all signed on to the Paris Agreement in 2015, there were calls for financial assistance from developed countries, which would have industrialized first, cause more harm to the environment, towards developing countries like ourselves, which would have contributed much less to the global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the UNFCCC requires that these developed countries provide climate finance that is new and additional to developing countries, and I stress new and additional. This is not meant to be finance that is already flowing in the form of official development assistance, but new flows of finance. And under the Paris Agreement, SIDS are listed as especially vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and therefore there should be some sort of special consideration when considering access to climate finance. Now, there is a climate finance gap following this Paris Agreement. Going back to the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference in 2009, we would see that there was a pledge for US $30 billion from 2010 to 2012. Then out of the Paris Agreement, there was an agreement for $100 billion from 2020 go forward. Now that $100 billion per year has not been met. In fact, it was barely met last year. My figure there is a bit dated, but the total global climate finance as of 2020 would have been $640 billion, so much lower than the targeted $100 billion. So this significant financial gap, if we look at the 2021 NDCs, we would see that the actual financing demand for our adaptation and mitigation goals from 78 countries amounts to $5.8 trillion by 2030. And as I said, we've only received $640 billion up to 2020. So we see a very significant climate finance gap. And these figures include adaptation and mitigation, but it does not include loss and damage. Only last year, the loss and damage fund was proposed and has only been operationalized this year. Now, there is still no consensus on how developed countries would share in the responsibility of financing climate mitigation and adaptation or the loss and damage fund. Now, this year, the COP, dubbed the Finance COP, they are speaking about the NCQG, and we're all eagerly awaiting to see what comes out of that. Now, looking at the climate finance literature, climate finance is still an ambiguous and diverse term in the literature. It's also politically contentious. It refers to local, national, and transnational financing from public, private, and other sources to support climate action, whether it's mitigation or adaptation, and now we're speaking about loss and damage, of course. It's still very much an emerging area of study. Now, looking at some of the studies, we see that 80% of the financing reported by countries from the UNFCCC was stated to be climate finance. Within the realm of climate finance is actually official development assistance. So remember, I said that when we signed on the Paris Agreement, climate finance was supposed to be new and additional. But in fact, we actually see that 80% of this finance would have been coming from traditional ODA channels. Now, the OECD calls for increased clarity on how the international community counts climate finance to ensure that our $100 billion target is going to be met. And of course, with the COP this year, that 100 billion target is going to increase, hopefully. And of course, we need to track what's going on when that happens. Now, looking closer to home, looking at SIDS, out of the global climate finance funds, you would see that SIDS receive just 2%. So we've been receiving just 2% of international climate finance funds. Now, the Pacific SIDS would have received the largest share at 47%, followed by us in the Caribbean receiving 34%. Of course, given our vulnerability, climate finance goes mainly towards adaptation projects and less towards mitigation projects. But most development financing multilateral institutions are more pro-mitigation type projects. And of course, we as SIDS face a number of challenges in accessing climate finance, as shown in the literature, because there are complex requirements and processes in accessing the fund. We have institutional and policy constraints. We often rely on a single provider. Once we receive funds, they're fragmented across several projects. Of course, we have limited domestic fiscal budgets. And lastly, most important, we have little voice in international financial institutions. So why study climate finance? Why do my studies look at climate finance? Well, of course, because there are limited studies which evaluate the effectiveness of climate finance in meeting SIDS climate goals, and of course, access to international climate finance. So the objectives of this study are to explore the climate financing needs of Caribbean SIDS on the implementation of their NDCs. So although there is a widespread discussion and policy debates on the quantities and sources of climate finance, there is very little assessment of how we are actually going to finance our goals. So given that this is a research conference, more about research and not so much about maybe the topics of research, I would just give you some of the background story into the research area. So the research stemmed from a UNDP project where I was looking at the NDCs of St. Vincent and private sector participation in the NDCs. So it was really looking at making the private sector greener and gender friendly. And it was the first time I came across looking at the NDCs. Coming out of that project with UNDP, I decided to start looking at the NDCs across all Caribbean countries, because you would find that these NDC reports actually contain quite a lot of information in terms of our climate plans, what adaptation plans we intend to implement, what mitigation plans we intend to implement. And I was looking at it through the lens of financing. If we have all of these plans, how are we actually going to finance these plans? And so the study takes a content analysis approach of these NDCs, looking at various dimensions of the NDCs. And out of studying these NDCs, these are just some of the papers that came out of the research. So you would see that the first paper got published in Climate Policy, and then following from this, I was able to then look at some specific sectors. So I have one looking specifically at the energy sector, then there is one looking at land and land use sector, there is one looking at the blue economy, and there's one actually looking at health in the NDCs. So this is just my little example of economies of scale in research, as to how as a researcher you can go about, building on your research. So what I'm going to present would be some of the findings coming out of some of the papers. So it's not related to one paper in particular, but the research coming out of several of the papers. And in the papers, what I do is that I make the case that Caribbean SIDS are a special case. We are a special case in that we are classified as high or upper middle income countries. The only exceptions in our region would be Haiti and Belize. Now, given that a large share of climate finance comes from traditional bilateral aid channels, remember we saw 80%, This high income status means that we are restricted in receiving development finance as well as concessional finance. Also, we've gone through a period of slavery and indentureship, as Sandeep would have said earlier. So we suffer deep-rooted inequalities based on our historical colonialism. Of course, we all live in the Caribbean, so we know that we are actually one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world, one of the most disaster-prone regions in the world. And again, because of our high income status, development aid is difficult to receive once these disasters occur. We've also been in a low growth, high debt trap over the past 2 decades. So economic growth in the region has been very low, resulting in low public finance to finance our climate goals, limited growth for jobs and opportunities, etc. And of course, the high debt means that, again, limited fiscal space for investment in climate activity. Also, when a disaster occurs, because we don't have access to the aid or the concessional financing, we are forced to borrow, and we are in this vicious debt cycle. So that's the unique case of Caribbean SIDS presented. Now, in the papers, what I do is I try to estimate the climate actions coming out of the region. So if we are to implement our adaptation and mitigation goals, what the cost would look like. So looking at the NDCs, you would see that some of the countries would cost their mitigation actions as well as their adaptation actions. And from this study, we would see that while some studies have been able to do so, only about half of the countries, have been able to do so. And within the half that would have done so, all projects have not been captured. And this gives us a total of about $51 billion in financing that we require to fund our adaptation and mitigation goals by 2030. Bearing in mind that this does not capture half of the countries, and in the half of the countries it does capture, not all of the projects are being captured. And that 51 billion represents 40% of our regional GDP. So we're talking about a huge figure being required. Of course, the larger islands of Haiti, Dominican Republic have larger requirements in terms of the financing required. Now, if we look historically at the climate finance received for the region, I looked at the period 2010 to 2015, we would see that just 1.3 million would have been received in climate finance. Now, this represents just 2.6% of that 51 billion financing required. So this gives us an idea of the huge financing gap we face as a region if we are going to implement our mitigation and adaptation plans. Now, just about 62% of this finance still came from grants, fortunately, but 38% from loans. Now, this 38% from loans is actually a very high figure among SIDS globally, because you would see that other SIDS, their climate financing needs, loans would be a much lower figure, around 10% per se. So a lot of our financing is being done through debt financing. So with my last 2 minutes, I would speak about how we go about sourcing the financing. So of course, we are reliant on international climate finance given our limited fiscal space. So in the NDCs, there's a lot of talk about reliance on international climate finance from multilateral agencies and bilateral partners. There's hardly any mention of the use of public finance or fiscal policy reforms in terms of subsidies or environmental taxes. And of course, there's very little mention of private sector activity. So what can we do going forward to bridge this climate finance gap? Well, we can advocate for increased climate financing. We can also advocate for a change from that income criteria to one looking at vulnerability, looking through perhaps our multi-vulnerability index. We can try to align our fiscal policies with our climate goals. So development policy and climate policy should be seen as one and the same. We should seek to build institutional and technical capacity in terms of writing grants. So when applying for climate finance, we need to have the right technical persons, right technical skills in applying for these grants. We should be developing bankable projects. Again, be presenting projects to our development partners that are bankable, that, something that an investor would want to actually finance. And we can lastly tap into innovative financing instruments. So we can tap into green finance, blue finance, gender finance, the loss and damage fund, blended finance, and various debt type financing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Mohan. Do we have any questions? We have 5 minutes. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Hi, Dr. Mohan. So my question is kind of going back to the funding piece. I'm a past student of yours, and if you remember, my study was, I'm looking at nonprofits and philanthropy in the region specifically. And oddly, recently, this week, I got connected with someone at CARE International, and this is more so kind of like following up with what you just presented, but I'm noticing that in the finance space, or at least in the philanthropic finance area, this region is only now becoming an interest. And I say that only because of the last 3 years of disasters. And I wonder if, and this is just a thought in terms of finance, like you talked about making it bankable, and everybody's looking at return on investment. But if the focus or the marketing of this might need to change, because I feel like the idea of climate change is such a big term that I think turns investors off, it feels like, because it feels like such a big lift. So I wonder if it would be better to kind of focus on if we focus on specific items or specific things, if that would make a difference in financing and attracting investors into the region.
Thank you for that question. Well, climate change is now being bandied around as, the be-all, end-all, the biggest crisis we're going to face, and we need all solutions for climate change. But there are a whole list of specific issues that you can list under climate change: gender-sensitive issues, elderly, indigenous communities, health, tourism, etc. So perhaps breaking down into the specific categories that you say can be helpful, but the more interesting answer I want to give about the question is in terms of the philanthropic space, and we're now entering into it. I think what has been a problem that we face as a region in terms of accessing philanthropic finance, is the scale of the projects. So the scale of our projects are so small that we're unable to actually make up enough of a budget to capture those projects. And so as a region, we really need to come together as a region through CARICOM and other regional agencies so that we can put forward programs that, can be of a larger share. It makes it more efficient to run. Donors would like to fund those projects. It's more transparent. It's more accountable.
Yes, thank you. So back to the topic of finances and the fact that Trinidad and Tobago and other Caribbean territories we don't qualify for a lot of the funding. How can we actually change that narrative? Because in the past, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, it wasn't that way. So I just think that, this is just a comment, that we need to lobby more for ourselves, because we are all connected, as you said, and we are all going to be affected by lack of research, lack of funding. Yeah, so that's just a comment.
Yes, it's okay. So I'll use my last 30 seconds quickly. So we need to be more innovative domestically. So yes, international climate finance is out there, and we would like to lobby to change from income to vulnerability, but there are a lot of things we can do domestically. So you would see that the public finance space, yes, we do have limited budgets, we do have high debt, but we do run budgets at the end of the day, and if we can make our budgets climate friendly, then public finance and climate finance becomes one and the same within our region without having to go to having to ask for international finance. Similarly with the private sector, if we can get private sector activity to flow from high emission activity to low emission activity, then we are again opening up a new financing space for us. We need to show the private sector that investments in the green space are profitable, it's going to create jobs, it's going to create profits for you and to enter into that space. And of course, there's a whole other range of innovative financing mechanisms we don't have time to get into, but carbon credits, blue bonds, green bonds, debt for climate swaps, etc.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohan. So I now hand over to Professor Maharaj, who will do our session summary.